Maria Santos adjusted the collar of her worn but clean dress as she stepped into the marble-floored lobby of the Sterling Tower. At 28, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the weight of 3 jobs and endless responsibilities that seemed to press down on her shoulders like an invisible burden. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands, though calloused from years of cleaning, were always meticulously clean. She clutched her small purse tighter as she walked toward the elevator bank, knowing she was about to enter a world that existed far above her own. The cleaning company had sent her to cover for another worker who had called in sick. Maria needed every extra shift she could get. Her younger brother Carlos was starting his final year of medical school, and the tuition payments were crushing their family's already strained budget. Their mother worked double shifts at a local diner, but it still wasn't enough. Maria had dropped out of college herself 3 years ago to help support the family dream of having at least one Santos child become a doctor. As the elevator climbed to the 42nd floor, Maria reviewed the instructions she'd been given. She was to clean the executive offices of Sterling Industries, one of the most successful real estate development companies in the city. The regular cleaning crew worked at night, but today's assignment was special. There was an important board meeting scheduled for the afternoon, and the offices needed to be pristine. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a hallway that looked more like an art gallery than an office building. Original paintings hung on cream-colored walls, and the carpet was so thick it seemed to absorb sound completely. Maria had cleaned many upscale buildings before, but this level of luxury still made her feel like an intruder in someone else's world. She found the supply closet and gathered her materials, then began working her way through the offices systematically. Each room was a study in expensive taste, from the mahogany furniture to the crystal awards displayed on custom shelves. Maria worked quietly and efficiently, taking care not to disturb anything unnecessarily. She had learned long ago that in places like this, being invisible was the safest approach. The executive conference room took nearly an hour to prepare. The massive table was made of polished black stone, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months. She cleaned every surface twice, arranged the chairs perfectly, and ensured that not a single fingerprint remained on the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the city below. As she worked, Maria couldn't help but think about the lives of the people who occupied these offices. What would it be like to make decisions that affected thousands of jobs, to live without worrying about next month's rent, to have the power to change things? She shook her head, pushing away such thoughts. Daydreaming wouldn't pay Carlos's tuition or put food on their family's table. The morning flew by as Maria moved from office to office. She was particularly careful in what appeared to be the corner office, which was clearly reserved for someone very important. The nameplate on the desk read, Alexander Sterling, CEO. The office was immaculate even before she began cleaning, but Maria went over every detail anyway. The bookshelf contained leather-bound volumes on business strategy and economics, mixed with what appeared to be first-edition novels. A photograph on the desk showed a man in his 30s with dark hair and intense blue eyes, standing next to an older woman who shared his strong jawline. Maria was just finishing the windows in Sterling's office when she heard voices in the hallway. She glanced at her watch and realized it was already past noon. The afternoon meeting must be starting early. She quickly gathered her supplies and headed for the supply closet, hoping to avoid the executive staff entirely. But as she rounded the corner near the elevator bank, she nearly collided with a tall man in an expensive navy suit. Maria looked up and immediately recognized him from the photograph. Alexander Sterling was even more imposing in person, with sharp features and an aura of absolute confidence that seemed to fill the space around him. He was accompanied by 2 other men in similar suits, all carrying briefcases and talking in low, serious tones. Maria stepped quickly to the side, keeping her eyes down as she had been taught to do in situations like this. But instead of continuing past her, Alexander Sterling stopped abruptly. His companions paused as well, looking between their boss and the cleaning woman with obvious confusion. "Where do you think you're going dressed like that?" Sterling's voice was sharp and commanding, cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the executive floor like a blade. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. She looked down at herself, suddenly, seeing her simple dress and worn shoes through his eyes. The outfit had seemed appropriate when she left home that morning, but now she felt exposed and inadequate under his scrutiny. I was just finishing the cleaning, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was heading to the supply closet to put everything away." Sterling's eyes narrowed as he studied her more closely. There was something in his expression that Maria couldn't quite read, but it made her stomach twist with anxiety. His companions shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what was happening or why their boss had stopped to question a member of the cleaning staff. "That dress," Sterling continued, his tone becoming more intense. "Where did you get it?" The question caught Maria completely off guard. She had expected criticism about her presence on the executive floor, perhaps a lecture about staying out of the way during business hours. But questions about her clothing were the last thing she had anticipated. It was my grandmother's," she said honestly, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "She passed it down to me." Sterling stepped closer, and Maria could smell his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of leather from his briefcase. His blue eyes were studying the dress with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the marble wall behind her. "Your grandmother," he repeated slowly. "What was her name?" Maria's mind raced. Why would this powerful man care about her grandmother? Was there something wrong with wearing the dress? Had she somehow violated some unwritten rule about appropriate attire for cleaning staff? "Elena Vasquez," she said, using her grandmother's maiden name as she always did when speaking of her. She worked in the garment district for many years. The effect of her words on Alexander Sterling was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face, and he took a step backward as if he had been physically struck. His companions looked at him with growing alarm, clearly sensing that something significant was happening but unable to understand what it could be. Sterling's hand moved involuntarily toward the breast pocket of his jacket, where Maria could see the edge of what appeared to be a photograph. His breathing had become shallow, and his usual composure seemed to crack slightly around the edges. "Elena Vasquez," he whispered, more to himself than to Maria. That's impossible." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The way he said her grandmother's name, with a mixture of recognition and disbelief, suggested a connection she couldn't begin to fathom. Her grandmother had never mentioned knowing anyone named Sterling, and certainly had never spoken of moving in the kind of circles that would have brought her into contact with wealthy real estate developers. "Sir?" One of Sterling's companions ventured cautiously. "Is everything all right? We have the board meeting in 15 minutes. Sterling seemed to snap back to the present moment, but his eyes never left Maria's face. She could see him studying her features now with the same intensity he had shown toward her dress, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly presented itself. "Cancel the meeting," he said abruptly, causing both of his companions to exchange shocked glances. "Sir, we can't cancel the board meeting," the other man protested. "The investors are already here. The Singapore deal, I said cancel it." Sterling's voice carried a note of absolute authority that brooked no argument. "Reschedule for tomorrow. Tell them something came up." Maria watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. She had somehow triggered a reaction that was causing one of the city's most powerful businessmen to cancel important meetings. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. Sterling turned his full attention back to her, and Maria saw something in his expression that she hadn't noticed before. Beneath the shock and confusion, there was a vulnerability that seemed completely at odds with his powerful position and commanding presence. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice much softer than before. "Privately." Now, Maria's mind raced through her options. She was just a cleaning woman who needed this job desperately. Refusing a direct request from Alexander Sterling could result in her being fired not just from this assignment, but potentially from the cleaning company entirely. But accepting his invitation felt equally dangerous, like stepping into unknown territory where the rules she understood no longer applied. "I don't understand what's happening," she said honestly. "I just came here to clean the offices. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." "You haven't caused trouble," Sterling said, and Maria was surprised to hear what sounded like kindness creeping into his voice. "But I think I think you might be the answer to questions I've been asking my entire life. He gestured toward his office door, which stood open behind them. Maria could see the photograph on his desk from where she stood, and, suddenly, she wondered if the woman in the picture might somehow be connected to whatever was happening. Please, Sterling added, and the words sounded strange coming from someone who was clearly accustomed to giving orders rather than making requests. I think your grandmother, and I might have more of a connection than either of us realized. Maria looked at the two business associates, who were still standing nearby with expressions of complete confusion. She thought about her family's financial struggles, about Carlos's medical school tuition, about the delicate balance of obligations that kept her life functioning. Whatever was happening here had the potential to disrupt everything she had worked so hard to maintain. But there was something in Alexander Sterling's eyes that made it impossible to walk away. A desperate kind of hope that reminded her uncomfortably of her own expression when she looked in the mirror each morning, trying to find the strength to face another day of endless challenges. All right, she said quietly, but I can only stay for a few minutes. I have another job to get to this afternoon. Sterling nodded, relief evident on his features. He turned. Alexander Sterling moved to the window and stood with his back to Maria for several long moments, his silhouette framed against the city skyline. The silence stretched between them until Maria began to wonder if he had forgotten she was there. When he finally turned around, she was startled to see that his hands were trembling slightly as he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a worn photograph. This picture has been in my family for over 30 years, he said, walking slowly toward her. My mother gave it to me before she died, along with a story I never fully believed until this moment. He handed Maria the photograph, and she gasped when she saw it. The black and white image showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to herself, standing next to a handsome man in a military uniform. The woman was wearing the exact same dress that Maria had on now, down to the delicate embroidered flowers along the neckline. That's my grandmother, Maria whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. But I don't understand. Who is the man with her? Sterling's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. That's my grandfather, James Sterling. According to my mother, he met your grandmother in 1952 when he was stationed in San Antonio before being deployed to Korea. They fell in love, but... He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. Maria could see the weight of family secrets in his expression, stories that had been carried for decades without resolution. But what? Maria prompted gently, still staring at the photograph in amazement. My grandfather was already engaged to someone else. A woman from a wealthy family back east, someone his parents had chosen for him. The engagement had been arranged since childhood, and breaking it would have meant losing his inheritance and his family's support. Maria felt her heart sink as she began to understand where the story was leading. She had heard similar tales from other immigrant families, stories of love found and lost because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. When he received his deployment orders, he promised Elena that he would come back for her after the war. He gave her money to help with expenses and told her to wait for him. But when he returned from Korea 2 years later, Sterling's voice trailed off, and he moved to the chair behind his desk, suddenly, looking much older than his 34 years. She was gone. Maria finished for him. My grandmother disappeared. Completely, Sterling confirmed. My grandfather spent months trying to find her. He hired private investigators, contacted immigration offices, even traveled to Mexico, thinking she might have returned to her family there. But it was as if Elena Vasquez had vanished from the face of the earth. Maria's mind raced as she tried to reconcile this story with what she knew of her grandmother's life. Elena had never spoken of any romantic relationships before her marriage to Maria's grandfather, and she had certainly never mentioned knowing anyone from a wealthy American family. So he married his fiancée, she said, more as a statement than a question. Yes, my grandmother Margaret. They had a comfortable life together, and eventually my father was born. But, according to my mother, Grandfather James never forgot Elena. He kept that photograph until the day he died, and he made my mother promise to keep looking for Elena or any family she might have had. Sterling reached across the desk and gently took back the photograph, studying it with the familiarity of someone who had memorized every detail over the years. My mother searched for decades, he continued. She hired genealogists, worked with immigration researchers, even posted advertisements in Spanish-language newspapers across the Southwest. But she never found any trace of Elena Vasquez or any children she might have had. Because she changed her name when she got married, Maria said quietly. She became Elena Santos when she married my grandfather in 1954. And she never told anyone about her time in San Antonio. The weight of this revelation settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. Maria began to understand why her grandmother had always seemed to carry a sadness that had nothing to do with the struggles of immigrant life. There had been another love, another life that might have been, if circumstances had been different. There's more to the story, Sterling said, his voice becoming even more serious. According to my mother, when my grandfather finally gave up searching for Elena, he discovered something that haunted him for the rest of his life. Maria felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. What did he discover? He learned that Elena had been pregnant when she disappeared. A neighbor from her old boarding house finally came forward months after Elena had left. She told my grandfather that Elena had been expecting a child but had been too afraid to tell him before he left for Korea. The photograph slipped from Maria's fingers and fluttered to the floor. She stared at Alexander Sterling with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. Pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed suddenly, clicking into place. My mother, she whispered. My mother was born in 1953. Sterling nodded grimly. Which would make her James Sterling's daughter, Maria finished, the words feeling foreign and impossible on her tongue. Which would make you and me cousins, Sterling said. First cousins, if the timeline is correct. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if everything she thought she knew about her family and her place in the world had suddenly become uncertain. She looked around the opulent office with new eyes, seeing not just the workplace of a powerful stranger, but possibly the domain of a relative she never knew existed. This is impossible, she said, shaking her head. My grandmother never. She would have told us if something like this were true. Would she? Sterling asked gently. Think about it from her perspective. She was a young immigrant woman in the 1950s, pregnant and alone, abandoned by a man who promised to come back for her. Maybe she thought he had lied to her, or maybe she was too proud to reach out for help. Either way, she chose to start over with a new name and a new life. Maria picked up the photograph from the floor and studied her grandmother's face again. For the first time, she noticed details that had escaped her before. The way Elena held herself in the picture, with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. The protective way her hands were positioned over her still flat stomach. The look in her eyes that Maria now recognized as the same expression she had seen in her own mirror during difficult times. My mother always said she looked exactly like my grandmother when Elena was young, Maria said slowly. Everyone always commented on the resemblance. And you look exactly like both of them, Sterling observed. When I saw you in that dress, it was like seeing a ghost. For a moment, I thought I was looking at the photograph come to life. Maria stood up abruptly and began pacing around the office, trying to process the implications of what she had just learned. If this story was true, it meant that her family history was built on a foundation she had never imagined. It meant that her mother had grown up never knowing her real father, never knowing that somewhere in the world she had a different family with resources that could have changed everything. Even if this is all true, she said, stopping in front of the window and looking out at the city below, what difference does it make now? My grandmother is dead. Your grandfather is dead. The past can't be changed. Sterling was quiet for a long moment before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of responsibility that Maria was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. It makes a difference because my grandfather never stopped feeling guilty about what happened. According to my mother, he spent the last years of his life consumed by regret over abandoning Elena and possibly a child. He left instructions in his will that if any descendants of Elena Vasquez were ever found, they should be provided for. Maria turned around to face him, her heart beginning to race. What do you mean, provided for? I mean that my grandfather set aside a substantial trust fund specifically for Elena or her children. It's been sitting in a bank account for over 20 years, growing with interest, waiting for the right person to claim it. The room seemed to spin around Maria as she tried to comprehend what Sterling was telling her. A trust fund. Money that had been waiting for decades for someone like her to appear and claim it. Money that could solve all of her family's financial problems in one miraculous moment. "How much money are we talking about?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Sterling hesitated, as if he were afraid that speaking the number aloud might somehow make it disappear. The original amount was $500,000. With interest and conservative investments over the past 20 years, it's now worth approximately $1.8 million. Maria felt her knees give out, and she sank back into the leather chair, staring at Sterling with complete disbelief. $1.8 million. More money than her family had ever imagined possessing. More than enough to pay for Carlos's medical school, to help her mother retire from the diner, to give Maria herself the chance to go back to college and pursue her own dreams. But there would have to be proof, Sterling continued, his business instincts clearly kicking in even as he dealt with the emotional impact of the situation. DNA tests, genealogical research, legal documentation. We couldn't just take your word for it, no matter how much I want to believe this story. Maria nodded, understanding the practical realities even as her mind reeled with possibilities. Of course, I understand. But if the tests prove what we both suspect, then you and your family would be entitled to everything in the trust, plus whatever legal remedies might be available for the years of hardship you've endured. Maria thought about her mother, working double shifts at the diner with aching feet and a tired smile, never complaining about the sacrifices she made for her children. She thought about Carlos, studying late into the night while working part-time jobs to help pay for his education. She thought about all the dreams that had been deferred or abandoned because of financial constraints. "This doesn't feel real," she said, looking around the office again. "This morning, I was just a cleaning woman trying to make ends meet. Now you're telling me that I might be the heir to a fortune that's been waiting for me my entire life." Sterling leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense and sincere. "Maria, I need you to understand something. This isn't charity, and it isn't a handout. If you are Elena's granddaughter and James Sterling's great-granddaughter, then this money belongs to you by right. It should have been helping your family for decades. But what about you?" Maria asked. "Doesn't this money belong to your family? Won't giving it to me cause problems with your relatives?" Sterling's expression grew dark for a moment, and Maria caught a glimpse of the steel that had probably helped him build his business empire. "My family has never lacked for money," he said firmly. "We've had every advantage, every opportunity. If we've been sitting on money that belonged to your family while you struggled to pay for basic necessities, then we owe you more than just the original trust fund. We owe you an apology and whatever restitution we can provide." Maria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances and the unexpected kindness of this man she had met only an hour ago. The weight of years of financial stress seemed to lift from her shoulders all at once, replaced by a hope so intense it was almost painful. "What happens next?" she asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Sterling stood up and moved around the desk, sitting in the chair next to hers rather than maintaining the formal distance of their initial conversation. "Next, we get answers," he said decisively. "I have lawyers who can handle the legal aspects and genealogists who can trace family histories. We'll need DNA samples from you and other family members, and we'll need to document everything carefully to satisfy the legal requirements for accessing the trust fund." "How long will all of this take?" "Probably several weeks for the initial research and testing, then additional time for the legal paperwork if everything checks out." "But Maria," Sterling paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "I want you to know that regardless of what the tests show, I'm committed to helping your family. If you're not Elena's granddaughter, we'll find other ways to provide assistance. And if you are, then I hope we can find a way to build a relationship beyond just the legal obligations. I grew up without knowing I had family on Elena's side. The idea that I might have cousins, people who share my grandfather's blood, is more meaningful to me than you might realize." Maria studied his face, trying to understand the loneliness she glimpsed behind his successful exterior. She thought about her own family, close-knit despite their struggles, always there for each other no matter what challenges they faced. The idea that Alexander Sterling, for all his wealth and power, might have grown up without that kind of unconditional support made her see him in a completely different light. "I should call my mother," she said suddenly. "She deserves to know about this immediately." Sterling nodded. "Of course. Use my office phone, or I can have my assistant arrange for a private room if you prefer." Maria shook her head. "Here is fine. But, Alexander, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "When you saw me in this dress, when you realized who I might be, was your first instinct to help or to protect your family's interests?" Sterling was quiet for a moment. Considering her quest, the conversation with Maria's mother had been emotional and difficult. Isabel Santos had listened in stunned silence as Maria explained the day's revelations, occasionally asking her to repeat certain details as if she couldn't quite process what she was hearing. When Maria finished the story, there had been a long pause before Isabel spoke. "I always knew there was something my mother never told me about her past," Isabel had said, her voice thick with tears. She would get this distant look sometimes, especially when she saw couples saying goodbye at the bus station or when war movies came on television. "I asked her about it once when I was older, but she just said some stories were too painful to tell." Now, 3 days later, Maria sat in a geneticist's office downtown, rolling up her sleeve for a blood draw that would potentially confirm or deny the connection to the Sterling family. Alexander had insisted on using the most reputable testing facility in the city, and he had arranged for expedited processing that would provide results within a week rather than the usual month. "This might sting a bit," the technician said as she inserted the needle. Maria watched her blood flow into the collection tube and wondered if it carried the genetic markers that would prove she belonged to a family she had never imagined being part of. Alexander had been remarkably supportive throughout the initial process. He had assigned one of his top lawyers to handle the legal research, and he had personally driven Maria to her appointments rather than sending a driver. Today, he sat in the waiting room reading financial reports while she completed the testing, but Maria could see the tension in his posture that suggested he was as anxious about the results as she was. When the blood draw was complete, they drove to the offices of Heartfelt and Associates, the genealogical research firm that Alexander had hired to trace both family lines. Margaret Heartfelt, the firm's founder, was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of public records. She had already begun preliminary research based on the information they had provided. "I found some interesting connections," Margaret said, spreading documents across the conference table. Elena Vasquez appears in several San Antonio records from 1951 and 1952. She had an address on Flores Street, and she worked at a textile factory that had contracts with the military base where James Sterling was stationed. Maria leaned forward to examine photocopies of old employment records and city directories. Seeing her grandmother's name in official documents from before her birth made the story feel more real somehow, less like a fairy tale and more like documented history. "I also found a birth certificate," Margaret continued, producing another document. A daughter was born to Elena Vasquez in March of 1953 at Santa Rosa Hospital. The birth certificate lists the father as unknown. Isabel's birth certificate. Maria had seen it many times over the years for various official purposes, but she had never thought to question the absence of her grandfather's name. Now that detail took on new significance. 3 months after the birth, Margaret continued, Elena Vasquez disappears from all public records in San Antonio. But I found marriage records showing that Elena Santos married Roberto Santos in El Paso in November of 1954. The bride's previous name is listed as Elena Vasquez, and she's described as the mother of a young daughter. Alexander spoke up for the first time since they had arrived. So Elena took her daughter and moved to El Paso, where she married Roberto and gave Isabel his surname. That's what the records suggest, Margaret confirmed. Roberto Santos appears to have been a good man who accepted Isabel as his own daughter. I found no legal adoption records, but census data from the 1960s lists Isabel as Roberto's child without any notation of step relationship. Maria felt a wave of gratitude toward the grandfather she had never questioned before. Roberto Santos had died when she was 12, but she remembered him as a gentle man who had treated Isabel with the same loving attention he gave to his biological children. The idea that he had knowingly taken on the responsibility of raising another man's child made Maria appreciate him in a new way. "What about the Sterling side?" Alexander asked. "Have you been able to verify the timeline?" Margaret nodded and turned to another set of documents. James Sterling was indeed stationed at Fort Sam Houston from January 1951 until his deployment to Korea in October 1952. Military records show he had regular leave periods that would have allowed him to develop a relationship with a local woman. And here's where things get particularly interesting. She produced a letter that appeared to be very old, the paper yellowed, and the ink faded but still legible. This was found among James Sterling's personal effects after his death in 1985, Margaret explained. It's a letter addressed to Elena Vasquez, but apparently never sent. Alexander took the letter with trembling hands and read it aloud. "My dearest Elena, I have returned from Korea and have searched everywhere for you. I know I promised to come back, and I have kept that promise, but I cannot find you anywhere. Mrs. Rodriguez at the boarding house said you left suddenly, with no forwarding address. I pray that you are safe and well. If you are reading this, please know that my feelings have not changed. I will find a way to break my engagement and make things right between us. All my love, James." The emotion in Alexander's voice as he read his grandfather's words was unmistakable. Maria felt tears forming in her own eyes as she imagined the pain both Elena and James must have experienced, each believing the other had abandoned them. "There are several more letters," Margaret said gently, "all written over the years, but never sent. It appears that James Sterling never stopped loving Elena or searching for her." Alexander set the letter down carefully, as if it were made of glass. "Why didn't he send them?" "Based on the dates and content, I believe he wrote them whenever he received new information about possible leads. But by the time he finished writing, the leads had always dead-ended. The last letter is dated 1983, 2 years before his death." Maria thought about her grandmother, who had lived until Maria was 25. Elena had died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, apparently content with the life she had built. But had there always been a part of her that wondered what happened to James Sterling? Had she ever regretted her decision to disappear without leaving any way for him to find her? "We'll know more once the DNA results come back," Margaret said, beginning to organize the documents back into folders. "But based on the documentary evidence, I'm confident that we're looking at a genuine family connection." As they left the genealogist's office, Alexander suggested they stop for coffee before returning to their respective obligations. They found a small cafe near the business district and settled into a quiet corner booth where they could talk without being overheard. "How are you handling all of this?" Alexander asked, studying Maria's face with concern. "It must be overwhelming to have your entire family history rewritten in a matter of days." Maria stirred her coffee absently, thinking about how to answer his question honestly. "It's strange," she said finally. "Part of me is excited about the possibilities, about what this could mean for my family's future. But part of me is also sad about all the lost time, all the years when we could have known each other." "I've been thinking about that too," Alexander admitted. "If Elena had felt safe reaching out to my grandfather after Isabel was born, if he had been able to find them when he came back from Korea, how different would all our lives have been?" "Your grandfather would have broken his engagement?" Alexander nodded without hesitation. "From everything my mother told me about him, yes. He was a man of honor who kept his commitments. But his commitment to Elena came first. The engagement was an obligation imposed by his family, not a choice he made freely." Maria tried to imagine an alternate version of history where Elena and James had found their way back to each other. Isabel would have grown up as a Sterling, with all the advantages that name carried. Maria herself might have attended private schools and prestigious universities instead of dropping out to support her family. "Do you ever wonder if we would have been friends if we had grown up knowing each other?" she asked. Alexander smiled, and Maria noticed how much younger he looked when his expression softened. "I hope we would have been. I was a pretty serious kid, always focused on living up to family expectations. Maybe having cousins who were more grounded in the real world would have been good for me. And maybe having family with resources would have given my mother more choices about her own life," Maria replied. "She's incredibly smart, but she never had the opportunity to use her intelligence in ways that would have fulfilled her. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in thoughts about paths not taken and possibilities that had been lost to time. Finally, Alexander spoke up again. "Maria, I want you to know that regardless of what the DNA tests show, I'm committed to helping your family. Even if we're not related by blood, the connection between Elena and my grandfather is real, and the injustice they suffered is real. That's generous of you. But I hope the tests prove we're family," Maria said. "Not just because of the money, although that would obviously be life-changing for us, but because I like the idea of having a cousin who cares enough to cancel board meetings when family matters arise." Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his entire demeanor. "That board meeting is going to be legendary in company folklore. I've never canceled a meeting for personal reasons before. My CFO is still trying to figure out what emergency could have been more important than the Singapore deal. Will it cause problems for your business? Nothing that can't be handled. The deal will wait another day or two, and the investors understand that unexpected situations arise. Besides," he added with a grin, "finding lost family members is a much better story than most emergencies I could have invented." Maria found herself relaxing in Alexander's presence in a way that surprised her. Despite their vastly different backgrounds and circumstances, there was something fundamentally comfortable about talking with him. Maybe it was the shared experience of learning about their family's hidden history, or maybe it was simply that they both understood what it felt like to carry responsibilities for people they loved. "Can I ask you something personal?" Maria said. "Of course. You're successful, wealthy, powerful. You could probably have any life you wanted. But you seem lonely sometimes. Is that fair to say?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the same seriousness he had shown when discussing business matters. "I think that's a fair observation," he said finally. "I've spent most of my adult life building the company and living up to the sterling name. I've had relationships, but nothing that lasted. Most women who are interested in me are more interested in what I represent than who I actually am. And the women who might be interested in who you actually are probably feel intimidated by what you represent," Maria suggested. "Exactly. It's a complicated balance to strike. Money and power can open doors, but they can also create walls that are very difficult to tear down." Maria thought about her own romantic history, which had been limited by entirely different but equally challenging circumstances. Men who might have been interested in her had often been scared away by the intensity of her family obligations, while men who claimed to admire her dedication usually turned out to be looking for someone who would take care of them with the same selfless energy she devoted to her family. "Maybe that's another reason why it would be good for us to be family," she said. "We could both use people in our lives who care about us for reasons that have nothing to do with money or what we can provide for them." Alexander reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his, a gesture that felt natural despite the short time they had known each other. "I'd like that very much," he said. "Whether the DNA tests prove we're cousins or not, I hope we can build a friendship based on what we've discovered about our family's connection." Maria's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it to see that her afternoon employer was wondering where she was. The reminder of her regular obligations brought her back to the reality of her current situation. "I need to get to work," she said apologetically. "Mrs. Chun gets anxious if her cleaning person is late, and I can't afford to lose any of my clients right now." Alexander nodded and signaled for the check. "Of course. Can I drive you there?" "That would be wonderful. Thank you." The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning that started like any other. Maria was cleaning an office building downtown when her phone rang with Alexander's number. She almost didn't answer, assuming he was calling to check in as he had done every day since they submitted the tests. But something in the way the phone kept ringing made her set down her cleaning supplies and take the call. "Maria?" Alexander's voice was tight with emotion, and she could hear papers rustling in the background. "Dr. Patterson from the genetics lab just called. The results are in." Maria's heart began to race, and she sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "And it's confirmed. We're first cousins. The probability is 99.97%, which Dr. Patterson says is as close to certainty as genetic testing can provide." The world seemed to stop moving around Maria as the words sank in. After a week of hope and anxiety, of imagining possibilities while trying not to get her hopes up too high, she finally had definitive proof that her life was about to change in ways she still couldn't fully comprehend. "Maria, are you there?" "I'm here," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I need a moment to process this." "I know. I feel the same way. Would you like me to come pick you up? I think we should celebrate. And there are some legal matters we need to discuss." Maria looked around the half-cleaned office building and realized that her days of scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans were about to end forever. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that very much." An hour later, they were sitting in the conference room at Alexander's law firm, surrounded by documents that would formalize Maria's claim to the trust fund her great-grandfather had established. The lead attorney, a distinguished man named Robert Caldwell, explained the legal process with the kind of thoroughness that justified his expensive hourly rate. "The trust was established in 1985 with very specific provisions," Caldwell explained. "James Sterling left explicit instructions that if any biological descendants of Elena Vasquez were found, they should receive the full amount of the trust plus any accumulated interest. The DNA evidence is more than sufficient to satisfy the legal requirements for distribution." Maria tried to focus on the lawyer's words, but her mind kept drifting to thoughts of her family. Isabel was working her regular shift at the diner, completely unaware that her daughter was about to make her financially secure for the rest of her life. Carlos was in class at medical school, studying for exams that he might not need to worry about paying for much longer. "How long will the legal process take?" Alexander asked. "Since the trust provisions were clearly written and we have conclusive genetic evidence, we can begin distribution immediately. There are some tax implications we'll need to address, and I'd recommend setting up some financial planning sessions to help Maria manage such a significant sum. But the money could be available within 2 weeks." 2 weeks. In just 2 weeks, Maria would go from struggling to pay rent to being a millionaire. The concept was so foreign to her experience that she felt almost dizzy trying to wrap her mind around it. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Caldwell continued, consulting his notes. "Mr. Sterling has indicated that he wants to provide additional compensation beyond the trust fund, as recognition of the years of hardship your family endured while this money sat unused." Maria looked at Alexander in surprise. "Additional compensation?" Alexander leaned forward, his expression serious and determined. "Maria, your family struggled for decades with financial problems that could have been solved if my grandfather had been able to find Elena. Your mother worked multiple jobs, you dropped out of college, Carlos took on massive debt for medical school. The trust fund addresses the legal obligation, but it doesn't address the moral debt we owe your family. What kind of additional compensation are we talking about?" Maria asked, still struggling to believe this was really happening. "I'd like to establish an education fund that will cover all expenses for Carlos's medical school, plus any graduate education you might want to pursue," Alexander said. "I'd also like to provide your mother with a pension that will allow her to retire comfortably, and I want to make sure your family has access to the best healthcare and financial planning services available." Maria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. The generosity was overwhelming, but more than that, it was the thoughtfulness behind it. Alexander wasn't just writing a check and walking away. He was thinking about the specific ways financial stress had impacted her family and addressing each one individually. "Alexander, this is incredibly generous, but I don't know if I can accept so much help. It feels like charity." "It's not charity," Alexander said firmly. "It's justice. And more than that, it's family taking care of family. If our grandparents had found their way back to each other, none of this would be necessary because your mother would have grown up with the same advantages I had." Caldwell nodded approvingly. "I've drawn up preliminary documents for all of these arrangements. Obviously, you'll want to review everything carefully and probably retain your own attorney to ensure your interests are fully protected." Maria's head was spinning with the complexity of the legal and financial arrangements being discussed. A week ago, her biggest financial decision had been whether she could afford to buy groceries and pay rent in the same week. Now she was being asked to make choices about trust funds and investment strategies that would affect her family for generations. I think I need some time to absorb all of this, she said honestly. And I need to talk to my family. They deserve to know what's happening before any final decisions are made. Alexander immediately stood up. Of course. Why don't we go see your mother right now? I'd like to meet her anyway. And she should hear this news in person. The drive to the diner where Isabel worked gave Maria time to think about how to explain the situation to her mother. Isabel was a practical woman who had learned to be skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true, a survival skill developed through years of financial struggle. Convincing her that their family's circumstances were about to change dramatically would require patience and careful explanation. The diner was a small, family-owned establishment in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where regulars knew each other's names, and the coffee was always fresh. Isabel was behind the counter when they arrived, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and her uniform spotless despite having worked since dawn. When Maria walked in with Alexander, Isabel's expression immediately became curious and slightly protective. Her daughter had mentioned the wealthy businessman who thought they might be related, but seeing him in person, clearly expensive suit and all, in her humble workplace, brought home the vast differences in their circumstances. "Mama," Maria said, approaching the counter carefully, "this is Alexander Sterling." "Alexander, this is my mother, Isabel Santos." Alexander stepped forward and extended his hand with a respectful smile. "Mrs. Santos, it's an honor to meet you. Maria has told me wonderful things about you." Isabel shook his hand cautiously, her eyes moving between her daughter and this polished stranger. "Maria told me about your theory concerning our family. It's quite a story." "It's not a theory anymore, Mama," Maria said gently. "The DNA test came back today. We're family. Alexander is our cousin." Isabel's face went completely still, and Maria could see her mind working through the implications of this confirmation. After a long moment, Isabel looked directly at Alexander. "And what does this mean for my family, Mr. Sterling?" Alexander's response was immediate and sincere. "It means that my family owes your family an apology and a debt that we can never fully repay. But we'd like to try." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining the trust fund, the additional compensation, and his desire to help the Santos family in whatever ways would be most meaningful to them. Isabel listened without interrupting, her expression remaining carefully neutral even as the numbers being discussed grew larger and larger. When Alexander finished, Isabel was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your family's guilt over what happened between Elena and your grandfather. But I need to know something. Are you doing this because you genuinely care about us as family, or because you feel obligated to solve a problem left behind by previous generations?" Alexander considered her question carefully before responding. "Both, if I'm honest. I do feel obligated to address the injustice your family suffered. But in the past week of getting to know Maria, I've also discovered that I genuinely care about what happens to all of you. I grew up without knowing I had family on Elena's side. The idea that I have cousins who share my values and my grandfather's blood is precious to me." Isabel studied his face intently, using the same instincts that had helped her navigate decades of difficult decisions and challenging circumstances. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because her expression finally softened. "In that case, Mr. Sterling, I'd like to hear more about these plans you have for our family." They spent the next hour going over details while Isabel finished her shift at the diner. By the time her replacement arrived, they had outlined a comprehensive plan that would address every aspect of the Santos family's financial needs while still preserving their dignity and independence. Carlos would be able to focus on his studies without worrying about debt. Isabel could retire from the diner and pursue interests she had never had time for. Maria could return to college to finish her degree or explore any other path that interested her. "There's one more thing," Alexander said as they prepared to leave the diner. "I'd like to invite your entire family to dinner this weekend. Not in some fancy restaurant, but at my house. I want you to see where I live, to feel comfortable in my world, because it's your world too now." Isabel looked at her daughter and then back at Alexander. "That would be very nice, Mr. Sterling. But I have one condition." "Anything. Call me Isabel. We're family now, and families don't use formal titles with each other." Alexander's smile transformed his entire face, and Maria realized that her mother had just given him something he had probably never received before: acceptance into a family based purely on affection rather than obligation or advantage. As they left the diner together, Maria reflected 6 months had passed since that transformative day when Maria first walked into the Sterling Tower wearing her grandmother's dress. As she stood in front of the mirror in her new apartment, adjusting the same dress for what had become an important family tradition, she marveled at how much had changed while the fundamentals of who she was remained constant. The apartment itself was a testament to the careful balance she had struck between embracing her new financial security and maintaining the values that had shaped her character. It was comfortable and well-appointed, but not ostentatious. She had chosen a neighborhood that was safe and pleasant, but still connected to the community where she had grown up. The walls were decorated with family photos and artwork created by local artists rather than expensive pieces chosen for their investment value. Today was special for multiple reasons. It marked the 6th-month anniversary of her first meeting with Alexander, but more importantly, it was the day Carlos would graduate from medical school, debt-free and ready to begin his residency at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country. The family gathering to celebrate his achievement would be the largest yet, including not just the immediate Santos family, but also several Sterling relatives who had embraced Maria and her family with genuine warmth. The integration into the Sterling family had not been without challenges. Some relatives had been skeptical of Maria's claim initially, suggesting that DNA tests could be manipulated and questioning whether the family should welcome strangers just because of a genetic connection. But Alexander had handled these concerns with patience and determination, making it clear that accepting Maria's family was not optional for anyone who wanted to maintain a relationship with him. The turning point had come during Christmas dinner, when Isabel had quietly helped Alexander's aging grandmother with her medication routine, while other family members were distracted by holiday festivities. The elderly woman, Margaret Sterling, had been moved to tears by Isabel's gentle care and had declared afterward that anyone who raised such a thoughtful daughter was welcome in their family regardless of genetics. Carlos had initially struggled with accepting what he called charity, despite Maria's explanations about the trust fund and the family connection. His pride had been wounded by the idea that someone else was paying for his education, and he had even considered refusing the help until Isabel sat him down for a serious conversation about family obligations that transcended individual pride. "Your job," she had told him, "is not to prove you don't need help. Your job is to become the best doctor you can be, so you can help other families who don't have the advantages we've been given." Now, as Carlos prepared to take the Hippocratic Oath, he had embraced the idea that his education was an investment in his ability to serve others. He had already committed to spending the first 2 years of his practice in underserved communities, using his skills to help families like the one he had grown up in. Maria's own journey had been equally transformative. She had returned to college to finish her degree, choosing to study social work with a focus on helping immigrant families navigate the complex systems that could provide access to education and opportunity. The irony was not lost on her that her newfound wealth had inspired her to dedicate her career to helping people who faced the same struggles her family had experienced. Alexander had become more than just a cousin who had helped change their circumstances. He had become a true friend and confidant, someone who understood both the obligations that came with wealth and the values that should guide its use. Their weekly dinners had become a cherished tradition, where they discussed everything from business strategy to family dynamics to their shared commitment to using their resources responsibly. The relationship had also changed Alexander in subtle but significant ways. He had begun involving himself more directly in charitable causes, moving beyond writing checks to actually engaging with the communities his donations were meant to serve. Maria had introduced him to the immigrant community where she had grown up, and he had been shocked to discover the talent and ambition that existed among people who simply lacked access to opportunities. Together, they had established the Elena and James Foundation, named after their grandparents, which focused on providing educational opportunities and business development support to immigrant families. The foundation had already helped dozens of students attend college and had provided microloans to help immigrant entrepreneurs start small businesses. As Maria applied lipstick in the mirror, she heard a knock at her door and opened it to find Alexander holding a small wrapped package and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek in greeting. "Are you ready for today's celebration?" "I'm so proud of Carlos I could burst," Maria admitted. 6 months ago, he was stressed about how to pay for his final semester. Today, he's graduating at the top of his class with no debt and a residency position that will let him make a real difference in people's lives. Alexander handed her the package. "This is for you, not for Carlos. Open it." Inside the wrapping was a small leather journal with Maria's initials embossed in gold on the cover. When she opened it, she found that the first page contained a handwritten note from Alexander for recording the next chapter of our family's story. The first chapter belonged to Elena and James, and their love story was interrupted but not forgotten. The second chapter belongs to us, and I believe it will be even better because we have the chance to learn from their example and write our own ending. Maria felt tears forming in her eyes as she read the note. "Alexander, this is beautiful. Thank you. There's something else," he said, his expression becoming more serious. "I've been thinking about Elena and James and what they would want for their families today. I think they would want us to honor their memory by building the kind of relationships they never got to have." "What do you mean?" Alexander took a deep breath before continuing. "I mean that I'd like to ask you to consider taking on a more formal role in Sterling Industries, not just as a consultant or advisor, but as a real partner in the business. Your perspective on community development and social responsibility has already influenced several of our projects, and I think you could help transform the company into something that would make our grandparents proud." Maria stared at him in surprise. "Alexander, I'm flattered, but I'm still in school. I don't know anything about running a major corporation. You know about hard work, integrity, and putting family first," Alexander replied. "Those are the most important qualifications for any leadership position. The business skills can be learned, but the character traits that matter most are already part of who you are." Before Maria could respond, her phone rang with a call from Isabel, who was at the graduation venue helping to coordinate the family's seating arrangements. "Maria, you and Alexander need to get here soon," Isabel said, her voice filled with excitement. "Carlos just called to say that he's been selected as the class speaker for the graduation ceremony. He wants to dedicate his speech to our family and the journey we've all taken together." As they drove to the graduation ceremony, Maria thought about Alexander's offer and what it might mean for her future. She had originally planned to complete her social work degree and then focus on direct service to immigrant families. But the idea of combining that mission with the resources and influence of Sterling Industries was intriguing. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they approached the university campus. "Anything. If I were to consider your offer, what would happen to the foundation? I don't want to abandon the work we've started there." Alexander smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask about that. I think the foundation should become a major initiative within Sterling Industries. Instead of being a separate charitable activity, it could be integrated into our core business strategy. We could develop affordable housing projects that serve immigrant communities, create job training programs that feed into our construction and development projects, and use our influence to advocate for policies that support economic mobility." The vision he described was ambitious and appealing, but Maria still felt uncertain about her qualifications for such a significant role. "What about your other family members? Wouldn't they resent an outsider coming in and suddenly being given so much authority?" "First of all, you're not an outsider anymore. You're family. Second, the family members whose opinions matter to me have all expressed support for involving you more deeply in the business. They've seen how your influence has already improved our community engagement and corporate responsibility initiatives." As they arrived at the graduation venue, Maria saw her extended family gathering in the parking lot. Isabel was coordinating a group photo that included not just the Santos family, but also several Sterling relatives who had driven in from other cities to celebrate Carlos's achievement. The sight of both families mingling comfortably, united in their pride for Carlos and their affection for each other, filled Maria with a sense of completion she had never experienced before. Carlos's speech was everything Maria had hoped it would be. He spoke about the importance of family support in achieving educational goals, about the responsibility that comes with privilege and opportunity, and about his commitment to using his medical training to serve communities that often lacked access to quality healthcare. When he mentioned his grandmother Elena and great-grandfather James, acknowledging how their love story had ultimately brought two families together and created opportunities for the next generation, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. At the reception following the ceremony, Maria found herself surrounded by family members from both sides, all eager to discuss her potential role in Sterling Industries and her vision for the foundation's future development. The conversations were energizing and inspiring, filled with ideas for projects that could make real differences in people's lives. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and family members began heading to their respective homes, Alexander and Maria found themselves alone on the terrace of the country club where the reception had been held. The city lights stretched out below them, and Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I've made a decision about your offer," she said, turning to face Alexander. "And I'd like to accept, with one condition." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "I want to finish my social work degree first. I think the education and field experience will make me a better partner in the business, and I want to prove to myself that I can succeed in that program before taking on additional responsibilities." Alexander's smile was radiant. "I think that's perfect. It shows exactly the kind of thoughtful decision-making that will make you an excellent business partner." As they shook hands to seal their agreement, Maria thought about her grandmother Elena and the choices she had made all those years ago. Elena had chosen to disappear rather than risk rejection or judgment, to start over rather than fight for the love she had found with James Sterling. It had been a decision born of courage and desperation, but it had also been a decision that had cost both families decades of connection and support. Maria and Alexander had been given the opportunity to make different choices, to build bridges rather than walls, to choose trust over fear. The dress that had started this entire journey was now carefully stored in Maria's closet, waiting for the next special occasion when she would wear it to honor her grandmother's memory. But more than that, Elena's dress had become a symbol of the connections that transcend time and circumstance, of love that endures even when separated by misunderstanding and missed opportunities. The simple garment had unlocked not just financial security, but a family legacy that would continue to grow and evolve with each new generation. As Maria and Alexander left the country club together, heading back to their respective homes, but planning to meet the next day to begin outlining their partnership strategy, Maria felt grateful for the series of coincidences and discoveries that had brought them together. The scared young woman in the cleaning company uniform who had encountered a powerful businessman 6 months ago had grown into someone who was ready to take on leadership responsibilities and use her new resources to create opportunities for others. The story that had begun with Elena and James's interrupted love affair had found its completion in the next generation's commitment to building something lasting and meaningful together. And as Maria looked toward the future, she knew that the best chapters of their family story were still waiting to be written, filled with possibilities that neither Elena nor James could have imagined, but that they would have been proud to see their descendants achieve. On how much her life had changed in just 1 week. She had discovered family she never knew existed, learned secrets about her grandmother's past that reframed her entire understanding of her family's history, and been offered opportunities she had never dared to dream about. But, perhaps most importantly, she had found in Alexander a relative who understood that true wealth wasn't measured only in money, but in the connections between people who chose to care for each other across differences in background and circumstance. The dress her grandmother had passed down to her had unlocked far more than just a financial inheritance. It had revealed a family legacy of love that had endured separation, loss, and the passage of decades, waiting for the right moment to bring scattered relatives back together. As Alexander drove Maria home to share the news with the rest of her family, she thought about Elena and James, the young couple whose love story had been interrupted by war and circumstance. They had never been able to find their way back to each other, but their descendants had managed to bridge the gap that had separated their families for over half a century. In just a few weeks, Maria would sign papers that would make her a wealthy woman. But she already felt rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. She had gained a cousin who treated her with respect and genuine affection, despite their different backgrounds. She had learned that her family's struggles had not been in vain, that they had built character and strength that would serve them well in their new circumstances. Most importantly, she had discovered that sometimes the most powerful inheritances are not the ones passed down through wills and legal documents, but the ones carried in old photographs, family stories, and simple dresses that connect one generation to the next in ways that transcend time, distance, and the artificial barriers created by differences in social class. As they left the cafe and walked toward Alexander's car, Maria reflected on how surreal her life had become in just a few days. She was riding in luxury vehicles and discussing trust funds while still needing to clean houses to pay her bills. The contrast felt almost absurd, but she reminded herself that nothing was certain until the test results came back. Still, as Alexander held the car door open for her and she settled into the leather seat, Maria allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to call him family. The idea of having a cousin who combined intelligence with genuine kindness, who understood responsibility and sacrifice even if his circumstances had been vastly different from hers, felt like a gift that was almost too good to be true. As they drove toward Mrs. Chen's house, Alexander mentioned that the DNA results would be available by the end of the week. Maria realized that in just a few more days, she would know whether her life was about to change forever or whether this had all been an elaborate case of mistaken identity. Either way, she was grateful for the experience of discovering that kindness and genuine concern could still exist in the world of wealth and power, and that family connections could transcend the boundaries of class and circumstance in ways she had never imagined possible. On with the seriousness it deserved. Honestly, my first instinct was pure shock. But my second instinct, the one that made me cancel the board meeting, was relief. For my entire life, I've carried the weight of my grandfather's regret. I've known that somewhere out there might be family members who were struggling while we lived in comfort. Finding you doesn't just mean righting an old wrong. It means finally putting my grandfather's ghost to rest. Maria reached for the phone on Sterling's desk, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed her mother's number at the diner. As she waited for the call to connect, she looked across at Alexander Sterling and realized that both of their lives were about to change forever. The simple dress that her grandmother had passed down to her was about to unlock secrets that had been buried for over half a century. And Maria had the distinct feeling that this was only the beginning of a story that was much larger and more complex than either of them yet understood. To his associates, and spoke in the crisp, professional tone that Maria imagined he used in boardrooms around the world. "Gentlemen, I'll need you to handle the rescheduling and make my apologies to the board. Something personal has come up that requires my immediate attention. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp." The two men nodded reluctantly and headed toward the elevator, casting curious glances back at Maria as they went. She found herself alone with one of the most powerful men in the city, standing in a hallway that cost more to decorate than her family made in several years. Sterling gestured again toward his office, and Maria took a deep breath before following him inside. As he closed the door behind them, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished surface and saw her grandmother's dress in a new light. Whatever secrets the simple garment held were about to be revealed, and Maria had the unsettling feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the opulent office. As Maria took a seat in one of the leather chairs facing Sterling's desk, she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life, or if fate had somehow guided her to this moment for reasons she was only beginning to understand.